The knight stood before the grand hall, his armor gleaming under the torchlight, his oath as unbreakable as the steel he wielded. He had sworn to protect his lady, not just in body but in soul, bound by a loyalty that ran deeper than blood. The kingdom buzzed with whispers of war, of treachery lurking in the corridors of power. Yet amidst the chaos, his vow was his anchor. In a world where alliances were as fragile as autumn leaves, he remained steadfast, an unshakable guardian in an age of turmoil. But loyalty is a blade with two edges, and as betrayal spread like wildfire, he found himself questioning the very fabric of his world.
Hello, I'm the storyteller of the channel, and I would like to ask for a second of your time to subscribe, activate the notification bell, and like the video so that YouTube can take our story to more people who are passionate about stories like this. Thank you, and without further ado, let's continue with our story.
The court was a nest of vipers, each noble hiding a dagger behind a smile. His lady, innocent in heart but ensnared in royal politics, was oblivious to the danger that crept ever closer. The knight saw the signs, the shifting glances, the hushed conversations behind velvet curtains. He had seen men fall not by the sword, but by the poison of deceit. And yet, his duty was clear. No matter the cost, he would stand between her and the storm. The kingdom's fate teetered on a knife's edge, the air thick with unspoken threats. The knight's presence alone was a warning to those who sought harm, but he knew that brute strength was not enough. The game of power required cunning, and his enemies played it well. He had trained to fight wars, not to navigate the treacherous waters of courtly intrigue. But now the battlefield had shifted. It was no longer about armor and swords. It was about whispers in the dark, and the silent wars fought behind closed doors. Through it all, his devotion to the lady remained unwavering. He had seen her kindness, her wisdom, the way she carried herself with grace despite the chaos around her. To him, she was more than a noble woman. She was a beacon of hope in a world sinking into shadows. And so he did what he had always done. He stood at her side, ready to shield her from whatever darkness came. But even he could not foresee the true depth of the treachery that was about to unfold. One night, as the castle prepared for the grand royal banquet, the knight overheard a name whispered in the halls, a name tied to a scheme far deadlier than any sword. His heart pounded as he pieced the puzzle together, realizing that the betrayal had reached its peak. A plot had been set in motion, one that would strike at the very core of his vow. He rushed to his lady's chamber, but the warning was too late. The banquet had already begun. The feast, meant to be a night of celebration, was now laced with death. He entered the hall, scanning the room with trained eyes. The lords and ladies laughed, their goblets raised in feigned camaraderie, but his instincts screamed danger. His gaze locked onto the chalice placed before his lady, a subtle glint in the wine confirming his worst fears. Time slowed as he realized the cruel choice before him. His duty, his loyalty, his very existence had been leading to this moment. Would he act in time? The air hung heavy with fate, and the next heartbeat would determine everything. The grand feast was a spectacle of opulence, with golden goblets reflecting the glow of chandeliers and laughter echoing through the vast hall. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine filled the air, masking the bitter truth hidden within a single chalice. The knight stood at his lady's side, his senses heightened, his pulse a steady drum of impending action. He had fought countless battles, but none as treacherous as this, a war waged not with steel, but with deception. And tonight the enemy's hand was already at play. His eyes followed the movement of the servants, each step calculated, each pore deliberate. Then, the moment arrived, the goblet placed before his lady, shimmering with the weight of unseen danger. His stomach tightened. He had seen poison before, smelled its faint trace in the air, understood the quiet cruelty it carried. The emotional story of the kingdom would soon take an unexpected turn, a medieval drama unfolding in real time. But he could not allow fate to script its tragic ending. Not tonight, not while he still drew breath. His mind raced. He could expose the treachery, but the villain lurked in the shadows, unseen yet omnipresent. A single wrong move, a misplaced accusation, and his lady would be more vulnerable than ever. The court thrived on scandal, and enemies awaited any excuse to dismantle her claim. He clenched his jaw, realizing the cruelest truth of all. There was no justice in the realm of whispers, no fairness in the halls of power. Honor was not won through words, but through sacrifice, and so he did what only a knight of true loyalty would do. Without hesitation, he reached for the chalice, his fingers brushing the cool metal as he lifted it to his lips. The lady gasped, her eyes widening in horror as she understood his intent, but his expression was resolute. This was his choice, his vow made flesh. The room seemed to blur around him, the cacophony of the feast dimming into silence. He had faced death on the battlefield 100 times before, but this was different. This was a battle of trust, of unwavering devotion, and in this moment he would prove beyond doubt the depth of his oath. The wine burned as it passed his lips, its taste rich, intoxicating, deceptively sweet. A heartbeat passed, then another. The room spun, his breath faltering as the poison coiled around his veins like an unseen serpent. Yet through the haze he saw her, the lady, his reason, his everything. And if this was to be his end, let it be known that it was not in vain. His sacrifice would be the turning point of this medieval drama, the moment when fate itself was rewritten. And then, the villain revealed himself, a smirk hidden behind his goblet. The knight had taken the first step into a deadly game, one he could not escape. The hall stood frozen in time, the echoes of the knight's last breath lingering in the air like an unspoken curse. No one moved. No one dared to break the heavy silence that had fallen over the court. His body lay motionless, yet his presence had never been stronger. The weight of his sacrifice pressed upon them all, an undeniable testament to an oath kept, a love protected, and a kingdom forever changed. The villain, once so certain of his control, now stood as the only man in the room without power. For how do you fight against a legend? The lady knelt beside the fallen knight, her delicate fingers trembling as they traced the cold steel of his gauntlet. This was not how their story was meant to end. He had given everything, not for a kingdom, not for glory, but for her. The court watched, unable to look away, as grief and love intertwined in a way that no throne or crown could command. This was no longer just an emotional story. It was an immortal tale, one that would be whispered through the halls of history, a medieval drama that would never be forgotten. Somewhere a nobleman lowered his goblet, the wine now tasteless upon his tongue. The weight of what had transpired settled upon the lords and ladies who had once reveled in their own intrigues. The knight had played the game differently. He had not sought to outwit nor to conquer. He had simply done what no one else had the courage to do. He had given everything without expectation of return. And that, more than any crown, was a power beyond measure. The villain took a slow step back, his usual confidence replaced with something foreign, doubt. He had seen men fall before, had orchestrated countless downfalls, but this was different. He had meant to humiliate, to destroy, yet now he was merely a footnote in the story of a man greater than himself. The knight's name would live on not in whispers of fear, but in the songs of the bards, in the oaths of warriors yet to come. And the villain? He was nothing but the shadow cast by a flame that refused to die. The lady rose, grief hardening into resolve. She turned to face the court, her gaze unwavering. They had all seen it, the truth, the honor, the love that had been laid bare before them. There was no need for words. The knight had spoken in the only language that mattered, sacrifice, and in that language he had ensured that justice would not be forgotten. The kingdom had lost a warrior but gained something far more dangerous, a cause. And so the legend of the fallen knight began. His name, once spoken only in passing, became the symbol of unwavering loyalty. His story was not one of tragedy, but of honor. And as the torches burned late into the night, one truth remained unshaken. His sacrifice was not the end, it was the beginning. The goblet felt heavier in his grasp, as if fate itself resisted his decision. The villain watched, his smirk curling at the edges, reveling in the spectacle of a knight willingly embracing his doom. But the knight did not waver. His lady gasped. A silent plea caught in her throat, her hands trembling as if she could stop what had already been set in motion. This was his choice, not forced upon him, not coerced, but a testament to the oath he had sworn. A knight's word was his life, and tonight his word would become legend. The room blurred as the poison deepened its grip, coiling around his senses like a serpent tightening its hold. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, a slow drum signaling the end. Yet his grip remained firm. This was no reckless act, no blind gesture of martyrdom. It was a declaration, a final defiance against the cruelty that ruled this kingdom. If his life was the price for her freedom, then so be it. He had lived by his sword, but his true battle had never been on the field. It had been here, in the shadows of treachery. The villain raised a brow, intrigued, but unfazed. So, this is how the tale ends? A knight slain by his own honor? He chuckled, swirling the wine in his own goblet, untouched by fate's poison. A wasted sacrifice. Who will tell your story when you are gone? His words dripped with mockery, but there was something else, something wary in his gaze. The knight met his eyes, a small knowing smile forming at the corner of his lips. Even in death, he had won. A villain thrives on fear, on power. And yet, in this moment, the knight had taken both from him. His vision darkened, the torches flickering like distant stars. He turned toward his lady, the only light that had ever truly guided him. She had been his reason, his anchor in a world that had long since lost its honor. He wanted to speak, to tell her that her life was worth more than his own, that he had never once regretted his vow. But words were fleeting, and his time was slipping through his fingers like sand in the wind. Instead, he mustered the last of his strength, reaching out, not for the goblet, not for the villain, but for her hand. A hush fell over the hall, the weight of what had happened settling upon those who had merely watched. The knight had made his final move, and though he was lost, his legacy was now written in stone. The villain's smirk had faded, the court stood in silent awe, and his lady, she held him, her tears falling like shattered diamonds. He had given everything, and in return he had taken something greater than life itself. He had become a legend, and with a final breath, he whispered her name, before the world faded to black. A slow, deliberate applause broke the silence, a chilling sound that sent a ripple through the banquet hall. The villain stepped forward, his robes dark as the schemes he wove, his smirk laced with cruel satisfaction. He had expected hesitation, fear, perhaps even a desperate plea. But the knight had stolen the moment, had turned the game upon its master. The room held its breath, the courtiers frozen between horror and intrigue. This was no longer a mere feast. It was a battlefield disguised in silk and gold, a medieval drama unfolding before their eyes. The villain's voice was smooth, a serpent's whisper masked in honeyed tones. Brave, he mused, lifting his own goblet in mock admiration. But was it wise? His gaze lingered on the knight who stood unwavering, though his veins already burned with the slow work of poison. A cruel game had begun, one where the rules bent to the will of its maker. "Tell me, Sir Knight, do you truly believe in fate, Or are you merely playing a fool's role in this emotional story? The question hung in the air like a blade, daring him to respond. The knight's fingers trembled around the chalice, but his eyes never wavered. He had faced enemies with blades sharper than words, yet this battle was one of endurance, of sheer defiance against the inevitable. He knew the villain's intent, to twist the knife, to savor the sight of a hero brought low, but he would not yield. A fool. His voice, though laced with strain, remained steady. Only a coward poisons from the shadows. A murmur spread through the hall. The knight had turned the accusation upon his enemy, and now the court listened. The villain's smirk faltered just for a moment. And yet here you stand, your life slipping away with every breath. He gestured toward the untouched chalices on the table. But perhaps I am merciful. A challenge, then, a simple test of fate. Who among us is willing to share in your misfortune? His hand drifted toward the lady's goblet. The threat was unspoken yet deafening. The poison had already found its way into the knight's veins. What if another sip sealed his doom? What if another cup claimed his lady instead? A hushed stillness settled over the court. This was no longer a display of power. It was a performance of cruelty, a twisted spectacle where the stakes were life itself. The villain leaned closer, his grin sharpening. "Let the lady decide," he whispered. "Shall we drink together, or will you fall alone?" The knight's vision blurred, but his resolve only hardened. He would not let her be drawn into this wicked charade. His oath, his honor, his very existence had been forged for this moment. He took a slow breath, already knowing his answer. With a final glance at his lady, at the horror in her eyes, at the unshed tears threatening to fall, he made his choice. There would be no contest, no chance for fate to play its cruel hand. The villain had set the board, but the knight would make the final move. And so, with the weight of destiny upon his shoulders, he lifted the chalice once more.